Water brought most of our ancestors to this continent. And water took them westward into it. Water was their road to freedom and sometimes riches, their source of inspiration and adventure. That's also true on the driftwood for a group of young people right out of college. With video cameras, they embarked on a 25,000-mile voyage, gathering stories along the way. Their adventure took 3 years and covered the eastern part of North America, from Nova Scotia to the Gulf of Mexico. They wanted to find out how the waterways influence our lives, and in turn, what we have done to the water. Travel with them to visit the places and meet the people they discovered along the way. Like a tribe of Indians known as the people of the dawn. A New England lobsterman whose way of life may be coming to an end. And a former whale hunter who's traded his dory for a motorboat. Join them as they travel through the cradle of the continent, the North Atlantic. There's a story behind this story. It all began as an idea shared by a father and a son. But the son, an award-winning filmmaker, died in an auto accident. His father decided to go ahead with the project as a kind of memorial. He bought a 60-foot motor yacht, named it Driftwood, and outfitted it with television equipment. He hired a professional crew to run the boat. On this part of the trip, it was headed by Captain Richard Bristol. Then he selected teams of Canadian and U.S. college graduates, young people who, like his son, wanted to share their discoveries with others. They signed on for about a month each. They got room and board, a salary, and a chance to help document what they saw on the waters. This leg of the voyage started out on the St. Lawrence River, which connects mainland Canada to the North Atlantic. Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, Canada's maritime provinces, are located there. Some say it's where Europeans first came to explore the waters of the New World and ended up settling a new territory. And it's where the Driftwood was headed as it set out on the St. Lawrence River from Quebec.
And the thing that I appreciated the most about traveling through the Maritimes, being from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, I was allowed to see another part of Canada, another culture.
Bill Arnold from Canada's Mohawk College was one of the first selected. He became a permanent member of the Driftwood video crew. He was joined by Tom Miller from the University of Florida.
We don't go in there as tourists and drive down the road and see the touristy things. We get vignettes of people's lives who live there.
Their first stop was Ile d'Orient, a small island in the St. Lawrence near Quebec City.
We arrived at a bed and breakfast. We were welcomed by John Godolphin and his wife and had a nice breakfast, and wonderful breakfast. And sat around and tried to speak French and failed.
But John, an Englishman, speaks fluent French. He learned it when he fell in love with a Frenchwoman from Quebec.
I was going to emigrate to Australia, but then I met Lorraine and then decided that can change destinations for Canada, so I came here and settled down here, and no regrets at all. I love the place.
The Godolphin's bed and breakfast, La Vigie du Pilote, the pilot's view, is in the community of Saint-Jean. For nearly 3 centuries, the village has been home to men who know this part of the St. Lawrence better than anyone else, river pilots. Headstones in the old village cemetery are chiseled with their names.
There was at one time 42 pilots living in the village. I'm the only one now left in St. Jean on a permanent basis.
He is also the only Englishman ever to become a river pilot on the St. Lawrence.
That was something very unusual, to have an Englishman to decide to become a river pilot on the St. Lawrence River, because it was a very well-known fact that pilots on the river were all French Canadians.
Well, it's a plum job, especially for a sailor who's been at sea for 10 years or so, and to be able to come ashore and have a bit of a family life instead of being away for 4 months at a time.
Now he's only gone for 2 or 3 days, the length of time it takes to guide a ship like the Bermuda Star out of Quebec City Harbor and a short way up the St. Lawrence.
Half astern starboard, half astern port.
John does his job with little fanfare. He wears civilian clothes and never touches the ship's wheel. His task is to advise the captain.
Half ahead, starboard, half ahead port. 060.
A captain cannot be expected to know all the different shoals and narrow parts of the river everywhere he goes in the world. He's fine in the oceans, but when he gets into restricted waters, it's strictly local knowledge, people that are in the river every day that can really know the dangers of the river. And that's why all ships coming into the St. Lawrence take a pilot.
He's familiar with the every channel and every turn, every rock, because he's done it hundreds of times.
One of the places John passes on his short voyage upriver is Ile d'Orléans.
And he blows the whistle. And with my dishcloth or dish towel, I just go and wave, and he does that on the way down and when he comes back.
That's mostly so that I get a taxi when I get to Quebec, so somebody comes and picks me up in Quebec.
To follow John Godolphin on a typical job, the driftwood crew overnighted on the Bermuda Star.
When I woke up that morning and looked out and saw the foggy view, that right there was my image of Canada, really. Very pretty to me.
Once the Bermuda Star enters the broad, deep channel of the St. Lawrence, John's work is finished. He transfers to a pilot boat, which takes him to the nearby town of Liscomen. He overnights there and then boards an incoming ship in the morning. Bill and Tom also left the Bermuda Star and headed back to their home. Their own 60-foot motor vessel sleeps 8. She has 4 staterooms, 3 heads, and a galley for preparing anything from light breakfast to a full dinner. Also on board, video cameras, tape machines, and other gear. The driftwood's top deck is large enough for a dinghy and a couple of motor scooters used to cover stories on land. Their next stopover was a village up the St. Lawrence called Tadoussac. It sits at the confluence of the Saguenay and the St. Lawrence, about 100 miles northeast of Quebec City.
Tadoussac's one of the first original settled towns in North America. It has a history dating back to the 1600s.
For generations, this area was home to men who made their living hunting seal and whale. Today, seal hunting is regulated. Whale hunting is banned altogether, and tourism has taken over Tadoussac. Rosaire McLean owns a small cafe in town called Le Gibard, the Whale.
He was there when Tadoussac wasn't the town that you may see now. All the tourist shops and the whale watching boats.
Whale watching is what replaced whale hunting, and guiding tourists on these excursions is what enabled Rosaire to buy his cafe. It's also where he met Henri Otis, the best whale guide around.
Through Rosaire, we had the opportunity to meet him and go out and experience the whale watching a little differently.
Henri knows how and where to find the giant whales as they move into Canadian waters for the summer.
Can you ask to turn the engine off? Oui. Merci. What kind of whales are we seeing here today?
Fin.
Fin?
Fin.
Fin whales.
Fin. Surtout la grande.
Like many people in Quebec, Henri Otis only speaks French. But Rosaire was there to translate.
He said sometime he touched the whales.
Oh, really?
He followed it, it flows with a small boat, and when the babe went out to touch it.
And then we'll go get some whales. Look at the whale up there. Jeez, will they hit us? Will they hit us?
No. We're coming right beside.
They were no more than 10 feet away from the boat. As they surfaced, look at this guy. Look out. Oh, my God. I was flabbergasted. Over here, Thomas.
Your adrenaline goes up.
Oh, Thomas.
Oh, that's beautiful.
There you are among the largest mammal
Beautiful.
out there in the sea, and he's swimming right at you. What do you do?
Oh, gee.
Get them just on time.
Henri! Oui! Ah, merci.
The driftwood next stopped at the village of Rivière-au-Renon. There they saw a way of life that first brought many people to this part of Canada. But fishing isn't the region's only valuable resource. If scenic beauty could be measured, the Gaspé Peninsula would be rich indeed. From the Gaspé Peninsula, the driftwood made its way across the Gulf of St. Lawrence to Prince Edward Island. Known by Canadians simply as the island, it is the smallest province. Some may remember it as the setting for the story Anne of Green Gables, with its lovely red-haired heroine. But visitors today quickly learn the island is best known for its rich farmland.
Prince Edward Island to Canada for potatoes is like Idaho to the United States for potatoes. So you go there and you want to find potatoes. We luckily came across these kids who were selling potatoes.
It was near Souris on the northeast coast that they happened upon Chris Macaulay.
Thank you.
He takes turns selling the potatoes with his brother Ryan. Paul Macaulay has given his sons their own plot. The potatoes they grow on it are theirs to harvest and sell, or anything else that comes to mind.
The best thing to do to potatoes without eating them is to get them rotten and throw them at each other. And they'd fight. They'd fight.
The boys live with their parents on about 600 acres of some of the most fertile soil in Canada. Their uncle and grandfather share the land.
Chris is the one who's going to be taking over the family operation as opposed to Ryan. Ryan wants to go off and do something else.
If that's true, Chris will be the 6th generation to take over the family business. Besides potatoes, the Macaulays have 75 head of dairy cattle. They have 200 acres of hay and another 200 or so in which they grow barley. But their major crop is potatoes, 3 varieties, which the Macaulays ship throughout Canada and the U.S.
Did this one for a while. Yeah, as you can see there's some very large ones there now.
Every year, the Macaulays convert more of their land to potato fields.
We're small here in potatoes compared to, lots of them, the 400,000 or 500,000 acres.
As in the U.S., farming here is a changing industry. Bigger farms, fewer farmers, fewer jobs. In Charlottetown, the capital of Prince Edward Island, tourism has become the major industry. But even that hasn't been enough to keep the island from having the lowest per capita income of any Canadian province. The island has little manufacturing to provide jobs for those who can't farm or fish. So every year, more people leave to find work elsewhere. And the drain has been going on for years. It is said that 1/3 of the population of Boston can trace its roots to Prince Edward Island. Just as Prince Edward Island relies largely on its farms for survival, Cape Breton Island depends on the sea. The surrounding waters, part of the Grand Banks, were once rich with mackerel, herring, and cod. The Portuguese were some of the first to fish this spot, shipping their catch back to the Old World. Among those who followed were the Scots. They settled on Cape Breton Island in large numbers and named their province of Nova Scotia New Scotland. Kelly Fitzgerald is Scottish on his mother's side, Irish on his father's side. His family came to the village of Dingwall in the middle 1800s and have stayed there ever since.
They came to fish and to build boats and to farm. If you meet 3 people, 2 of them are fishermen.
But their livelihoods are threatened. There are fewer fish. And that's a big problem for Kelly. He owns a fish processing plant, and it's the only work he knows.
I don't have much choice. I have, all my life is invested, you know, in the fishery. And you can see, you know, what we have here, and, you know, we built all this ourselves.
Times are so tough here that Kelly's small plant is the biggest employer in town. It's run the traditional way, preserving fish as islanders have for generations. First it's filleted, then it's salted. It soaks for a couple of days, then it's set out on nets to dry. In the old days, this was the only way fishermen could preserve their catch. Today, even though we have refrigeration, there's still a demand for Kelly Fitzgerald's dried, salted cod. Portugal continues to be a big buyer, as well as smaller, underdeveloped countries, so Kelly has a market for his fish. The problem is, they just aren't around like they used to be, and that goes for all varieties of fish.
But not too long ago, we were catching 2 million pounds of mackerel a year. This year, we caught about maybe 500,000 pounds. What's going to happen in the next 2 or 3?
And he sees a way of life disappearing. And I can understand that. I can feel that for him. And I don't think I'd like to see it go either.
Survival is a familiar theme on Cape Breton Island. In the 18th century, a group of French colonists known as the Acadians moved here to get away from the British. They'd been on the losing side when Britain took North America from France. Longfellow's poem Evangeline tells how some Acadians fled to Louisiana. They became known as Cajuns. Other Acadians found safety in Nova Scotia, a French stronghold, and settled in fishing villages like Cheticamp. But wherever they went, the Acadians took their music with them.
This time, the tradition isn't handed down with schooner boats or dories or farming. This tradition is musical.
The words to an old song. It was on the 6th of December, 1917, that Halifax suffered disaster, the worst she'd ever seen. It was 5 minutes after 9. Those still alive can tell that the beautiful city of Halifax was just given a taste of hell. Halifax lies to the south of Cape Breton Island on the east coast of Nova Scotia, and driftwood headed there next. Today, it is a lovely city with a fine natural harbor. But during World War I, Halifax was a military base, yet not one shot was ever fired there in anger. On that cold December morning in 1917, a Norwegian freighter collided with a French vessel loaded with explosives. The blast killed more than 2,000 people and devastated much of the city.
It was the largest man-made explosion until Hiroshima.
Janet Kitts is an authority on the Halifax disaster.
The scientists who were planning the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima, actually studied the effects of the Halifax explosion to work out the amount of explosive they would need for Hiroshima.
Mrs. Kitts wrote her master's thesis about what happened there and has befriended many survivors of the tragedy.
Yes, the snowstorm may have... But
John Tappan was a young ship's boilerman working on another vessel in the harbor.
And if I hadn't been called over to the ship just before the ships collide, I wouldn't be telling you this story now.
Wow. Did you get hurt?
No.
Not a bit?
Isn't
Not a bit.
that amazing?
Just lost the buttons off my vest.
He's 90 years old, and to hear him talk about it gave me goosebumps. So it all happened out there?
Just about there.
When you hear someone talk about it who has experienced it, it's just, it brings you there.
Mrs. Ann Welch's story is just as dramatic. She was 18 months old. Her father was overseas in the war. The blast killed her mother and her brother. But somehow Anne survived. Rescue workers found her in a pile of debris.
Very, very difficult. It must have been...
That's what they found me in the ash pan off the stove. You probably wouldn't know.
Mrs. Welch and Mr. Tappan and thousands of other survivors then became the focus of one of the greatest relief efforts in North American history.
On the 6th of December, before the day was finished, a complete train had been mounted in Boston. They sent enormous quantities of help. So did other people from all over Canada, from Toronto, Montreal, all over Nova Scotia. But I think most people in Halifax do remember Massachusetts because they were exceptionally generous.
Now, every Christmas, the people of Halifax send a 60-foot tree to Boston.
Sort of a thank you to the people of Massachusetts.
Today, it would be hard to tell such a thing ever happened in Halifax. The devastation has long since been cleaned up. In the ensuing years, it has become Canada's largest naval base and that nation's most important seaport. But it may not be Canada's most colorful port. That title could easily go to Lunenburg, down the coast a ways.
The entire life of everything there is centered around this harbor. So you have the harbor and you have the water there, and you have all the houses and all the shops along there, and then it sort of just dissipates as it goes into land. And that seems to be a pattern I noticed all along the Maritimes on these little harbor communities.
People who had originally come here to farm soon switched to shipbuilding. Tall firs nearby made ideal masts. Generations of craftsmen turned out some of the swiftest, sleekest boats on the Atlantic, like the legendary Blue Nose. When Hollywood needed a first-class copy of the Bounty, this is where they came. For a time back in the Roaring '20s, the town was a no-holds-barred haven for rum runners. But today, something else has replaced booze as the town's major product.
We went to Lunenburg in hopes of capturing maybe what Lunenburg is known for, and that's the scallop industry. And we did.
And that's an example of how, when the original settlers came here, they were making their livelihood from the water, from the ocean.
Need a lumber? He'll work. 25 bucks.
And that's where everything was concentrated, was right there at the water level, right there at the shoreline.
Man is dependent upon the sea there, and so their world is centered around that.
I think when you notice that, you realize how much the water plays a role in their life.
Working the Atlantic on a fishing boat is not only hard, it's dangerous. As the old saying goes, there are no atheists in storms at sea. Violent squalls often brought sailors and loved ones closer to their God. The evidence of that is in the countryside. The driftwood next headed out across the Bay of Fundy, a body of water that separates much of Nova Scotia from the rest of Canada and Maine. The bay is famous for its powerful tide, the only place in the world where it ranges 40 feet from high to low. And it's where the crew first learned about weir fishing. Weirs are barriers of sticks and netting. Fish swim in when the tide is high and are trapped when it goes out.
It's an old art of fishing that the Indians first used and then was handed on to the white man.
They have to work with the tides, and so their whole lives are controlled by the rhythms of nature. They've got 2 times when they have to work, and one of them happens to fall in the wee small hours of the morning, and the other one happens to fall around lunchtime or a little bit later in the afternoon.
You can't have a good, happy life if you're unless you like fishing. That's all there is to it.
Gerald Lewis works a weir he says is about 200 years old. It's been handed down for generations.
Well, I started it when I was young with a couple of old people. My brother and I, we started ourselves, and then he quit, and then I just kept on going.
It goes out onto the mud flats in the Bay of Fundy when the tide is low.
This weir net is just on the outskirts of this little squatter village, and it was just something out of a western almost. It looked like that he was going out into a desert, because there he went out in his horse and buggy out into this place that was normally filled with 40 feet of water, and it was dry, basically. And way out at the end of it, you see his little nets. They use all-terrain vehicles, and that also works, but to me it seems a lot more romantic and a lot more traditional to go out there by horse and buggy.
The young generation ain't interested in it. It's too long of hours and too much work.
And if the tides are running too low, as they were when Bill and Tom were on the Bay of Fundy, it hardly seems worth the trouble. With all that working against them, it's easy to see why there are fewer and fewer weir fishermen around.
That time I'm the only one left. When I'm gone, there'll be nobody else, I guess. I don't want to see it to go down, but it might. I said, then when I'm through, anybody who takes it can have horse, wagon, nets, free, as long as they fish.
As the driftwood crossed the Bay of Fundy, it passed from Canada into the United States. Every month, a new intern comes on board the driftwood. Matt Martinez from Cleveland State University in Ohio joined them in Maine.
Matt was perhaps had a better feel than most interns had coming aboard driftwood. Yeah, he's done a lot of sailing in Lake Erie, Cleveland area, and coming aboard was, I think, very natural for him.
The tides of the North Atlantic were something new for Matt. On the Great Lakes where he grew up, they don't have anything like it. He realized that when he came upon some Native Americans working their weir.
You could actually see the tide rising right in front of your eyes, and the men working frantically trying to get the catch together before it got too high.
Donnell Dana and his crew are Passamaquoddy Indians.
They're called the people of the dawn. They're the first to see the sun in the continental United States.
It's like an energy that comes to you, and that sun comes up over that horizon and going out and away and catching herring.
After they get the fish trapped in the weir cage, they sling a net all the way along the outside of it.
The women take scissors and cut the heads.
And then they purse it, which is a way of pulling the net together to gradually circle in around the fish.
Yeah, she's pursed.
It's like the water began to bubble, and you just saw all the fish began to come to the surface, and the water was just teeming.
Donnell Dana and his family live on the Pleasant Point Indian Reservation near Perry, Maine. They live in a house Donnell built himself. The Passamaquoddies have always lived here. After the white man came, they shared their land. And during the American Revolution, they helped the colonists defend it. After the war was won, the Americans rewarded the Passamaquoddies in an odd way. They took their land from them. A couple of hundred years passed. Then, in 1975, The Passamaquoddies sued the federal government to regain their land and made history when they won. They didn't get it all back, but they got some, and millions of dollars besides. Winning the suit strengthened their resolve to keep what's left of their culture alive.
The money is just paper. The tradition is more important. If they lose their tradition, they lose their heritage, and that could be gone forever, never to return. They have to pass it on down.
If the children are not taught the way of the old people, it'll just stop. There's a lot of children now, you talk Indian to them, they look at you and say, what? You know, they don't know. My children, I can talk to them, and they know exactly what I'm talking about. And I think it's really important that we don't lose our language.
Okay. Done. Yet. Nid.
Recently, Donnell's wife Dolly started teaching the Passamaquoddy language in the reservation school.
This.
I tried to tell them what I think our culture was like before. We don't have a lot of it written down. It's being passed on orally.
That's how much I'll get girls.
In the Dana home, it's also being passed on by example.
We try to live as close to the land as we can. The fish, the bear, moose meat, deer meat, the vegetables that we grow in our garden. I feel that's all part of our culture.
They want to carry on the tradition because they love this lifestyle. I mean, it's clean, it's fresh, it's unspoiled, and it's something that they, I think, really want their children to experience.
The Driftwood's next port was Southwest Harbor, Maine. Around these parts, boats are important tools for living, both for work and play. As a result, making them is a highly regarded craft, and there is no better boat builder around than Ralph Stanley. Ralph's English forebears were fishermen who came to the New World in 1755. They settled off the Grand Banks and eventually moved south to New England. Ralph says there's no truth to the rumor that one of his relatives built the boat Washington used to cross the Delaware. But there's no denying that Ralph Stanley has built a lot of famous ones.
The boat that I think has gained most notoriety is his friendship sloops. Built them for many people around the area. He's won many races in his friendship sloops.
Ralph makes all kinds of boats. Big ones designed for lobstering. Little boats that are just for getting around in.
It's something you have in you. It'd be awful hard for me to start building boats.
Ralph crafts them the old-fashioned way. No computers, just a sense of how it should look when it's finished.
It's kind of like putting a puzzle together to make all the lines come together and line up in fair outward.
Peter Forbes, an architect and boat enthusiast, has a special appreciation for Ralph's talent.
The closest reference that I can think of for that is Michelangelo saying that sculpture was really easy. All you had to do was cut off the extra. The statue was right there in the marble. Ralph can see it in the wood. He just has to cut off the extra.
A few years ago, Peter's son Alex wanted a boat, so Peter naturally turned to Ralph. The result was a trim little craft called Bucephalus. And that's what another Alex, Alexander the Great, called his horse.
Oh, you got a nice red streamer up there.
Oh, yeah. When Alex was 14 or 15, he and Ralph went off sailing for 4 or 5 days in one of Ralph's friendship sloops and talked endlessly, I have a feeling, about what kind of a boat Alec would like. He knew that it was something that would be very good for Alex. So he built it on the understanding that Alex would do all the finish work, the painting and the varnishing, which I think was very good because that gave Alex a stake in the boat.
One of the roller blind sails on it.
If Ralph Stanley would build me a boat, I would take it in a second and pay whatever price that he asked, because it's made with tradition and love and care.
There are boatyards all along the coast of Maine, some as old as Ralph's, others even older. Maine's shipbuilding heritage owes a lot to the state's natural resources. As in Lunenburg, the spruce, oak, and fir trees native to the area made great boats. And the rivers that fed into the Atlantic were the perfect places to launch them. The first ocean-going ship built in the New World sailed out of the Kennebec River near Bath, Maine in 1607. Since then, lots of shipyards have lined the river's banks. The most famous is Bath Iron Works. In the last century, over 400 ships were launched there. Luxury yachts for the Vanderbilts and Morgans, a racing sloop that won the America's Cup, and a record 82 destroyers for World War II. Today, Bath Iron Works builds almost exclusively for the United States Navy. The yard's reputation for quality, economy, and on-time delivery is paying off, making it one of the top 5 military contractors in the United States. Business moves up and down with the government's demand for ships. When the driftwood went through, business was up. As a result, employment at the ironworks was very high. The streets of Bath reflected the company's success.
The first time we went into Bath, all we saw were cars backed up for as far as we could see. As it turned out, it was everybody leaving the BIW, Bath Iron Works.
It's the largest private employer in Maine. Over 11,000 people coming to work each day. One of them is Jean Dwinell. 15 years ago, she was a divorced mother of 2, struggling to make a living.
I was working in the heel factory, spraying heels, mixing paints, and then I decided to get a better job with more security. So I applied down Bath Iron Works, and I was accepted for the welding school. After that, I made boss. I was a welding boss. I did that for 8 years. I got to learn a trade, and I started making a good income. And I started getting things for me and my children.
Generations of craftsmen have worked at Bath for the same reasons. Traditionally, sons have followed fathers. Now Jean's daughter is following the same path.
The job she had wasn't paying much. So I told her, why don't you go down to Bath and apply for the welding school? It's a great trade, so she did. She's been welding 2 years, and she has her own car. She has her own apartment now.
She also has the satisfaction that comes from seeing the finished product.
I think it makes everybody feel good. When the ship goes down in the water, we all look at it and say we're all part of it.
And she had a hand in the building of one of these huge vessels that are part of the United States Navy.
Boat building is just one aspect of the good life along the Maine coast. There are many other pieces of that story. Maine is a remarkable place that attracts a wide variety of people, like Mike Kimball and Mark Melnikov of New Brunswick.
And you know,
You might think they're just a couple of guys having fun at the beach. Not so. They're covering the clam races for a local newspaper.
runners, take your mark.
Clam races?
Go! Now, this is your victory lap. Bon voyage.
Their paper is called the Maniac Express, and it's not your run-of-the-mill tabloid.
One of our mottos is we don't make the news, we make it up.
And that might make it the most honest paper in the country. In truth, it's a sort of a national lampoon for Maine. Here are some samplings, an unusual story of a small boy raised from infancy by lobsters. Here's one, Clam saves shipwrecked sailor. Or how about whale sucks sleeping twins from condo. There are even recipes, like this one for smothered duck. It calls for a bird, of course, and butter, and salt, and one small pillow. Whenever these guys find an interesting photograph, they make up a caption. For instance, Mark found a picture of some workmen dynamiting trees and made it into a story about a new method of hunting deer.
One of the advantages of this method of hunting is you don't have to actually cook the deer. You actually cook it as you kill it.
It's easy to see that if a guy is busy all day creating news, he has little time for anything else, like his garden.
Well, I used to weed it a lot, but God, you know, you start weeding, and pretty soon you find that that's all you're doing is weeding.
There's an unrestored taxi cab.
This is the checker. This should have been cut last May, a year ago. May. It doesn't stand up by itself anymore. It just falls. But now that's all that's left.
The Driftwood crew felt fortunate to be on hand for a major breaking news event. The story, innocent Maine lobsters being held captive by fishmongers. The problem, they will soon be devoured by tourists. The mission, to set them free.
He's got some lobsters ready.
Even something very intelligent, very mature people.
All right, don't move. We're taking this lobster.
Here they are taking 2 lobsters hostage. It wasn't a pretty sight.
Before they set the lobsters free, they wanted to show them a good time at the beach.
Hey, you guys are going to be having fun. Yeah. Yeah. Go, baby, go. Yeah. Woo! Get a ride. Yeah. Had a real fun time today. Bye.
The next issue of the Maniac Express will banner the story of the great lobster liberation.
Yeah, what a day it's been.
Well, it's been a happy day for those lobsters.
been
A little
an exciting
traumatic at
day.
first because they were in and out of the water. I mean, they were within that close to
Of the
death.
boiling water,
That close to
yeah,
death.
yeah.
Reminds me of Dostoevsky, you know about him?
Yeah.
He was on the firing squad and they pointed the guns at him and then they said, okay, that's it.
Really?
It's just a joke. Those lobsters may be going off to write the great Maine novel.
And what a story he'll have
Yeah.
to tell, huh?
Yeah.
The Driftwood continued south to Gloucester, Massachusetts. Gloucester, with its famous Fisherman's Memorial, has been an important fishing center since colonial days. And for all of those years, fishermen like J. Gustafaro have been setting out each day to bring in their catch.
I think if you're ever going to experience going out with a true lobsterman aboard his boat, that was the day to do it. You picture the eeriness, the fog, the loud foghorn, and going out to catch some lobster.
Jay studied marine science in college, but a lobsterman is all he's ever wanted to be.
A day's around 8 hours. We get bait in the morning. We go out, we usually haul around 300 traps. So if we get between 100 and 200 pounds, that will make you a living.
The traps and the techniques haven't changed in 200 years. Bait such as herring and mackerel is placed in one end of the trap, the end called the kitchen. The hungry lobster crawls into the kitchen for a bite to eat, and he's trapped. The work's as hard as ever, maybe harder, because these days a lobsterman spends a lot of time tossing undersized lobsters back into the ocean.
This one might make it. No, it's too small. See, that one's real close. That one's also a female, so that has a chance to breed, before it's caught. This one is also too small. In recent years, he's been discovering that a lot of the lobsters have been literally damaged with the pollutants that have been dropped into the water. Some of the lobsters are deformed, malformed. They will have scars, they will have holes in the shell. And it's depleting the numbers of lobster, and it's beginning to really hurt the lobstermen. For 350 years, there's been a lot of fish landed here. It's a good way of life, and pollution is directly threatening that by attacking the young of the species. Oil drilling on Georges Bank will threaten the eggs. The nuclear power plants threaten the eggs. Coastal development does it, and yet, be it for money, for the established order, for whatever reason, we're seeing a great way of life here go down the drain.
Fishing has always been a big part of life on the North Atlantic. Some of the most productive waters surround Cape Cod and the islands that lie below. The largest of these is Martha's Vineyard. It was settled first by Wampanoag Indians. For years, they fished and hunted whales. According to Wampanoag myth, the last of the tribal chiefs saw a white whale rise from the water. He warned that a new people, the color of the whale, would one day come and take over the island. Soon after, European settlers discovered Martha's Vineyard. Like the Indians, they survived by fishing and hunting whales. When whaling died out, the resort business took over. Thousands of people come to the island every summer. The big attraction, great fishing.
We saw fishermen in just about every capacity, all different methods. Small children with little poles at the various little inlets, fishermen with large poles on the beaches, people in small boats, canoes, kayaks, and rowboats, all out there to try to get their best catch for the tournament.
They're competing in the Martha's Vineyard Striped Bass and Bluefish Derby. Anglers vie for titles like heaviest bluefish caught from a boat, heaviest bonito from shore. You get the idea. The contest was started 45 years ago to encourage visitors to the island off-season. Now it's one of the biggest fishing tournaments on the East Coast. Each year, more than 2,500 people show up. Anyone can compete, rich or poor, old or young, out-of-staters, or locals like Lee Welch. Lee is an electrical contractor who used to summer here with his family. When he started fishing in the tournament, he found he spent more and more time here. So 8 years ago, he moved to Martha's Vineyard full-time. Does living on the island give him an edge?
Well, I'd have to say yes, because we're getting the local scuttlebutt every day and do fish it a lot more than they do. Their advantage is that when they're down here, usually they come down here for a week, so they can spend the whole day hunting and get into a rhythm and do well.
This is Lee's 13th tournament. He's won before. He even holds a record.
Dad, don't do one of your famous tricks like grabbing the line.
But for him, the tournament is more than winning.
Trust me. He uses fishing as a vehicle to get closer to his children. He's had daughters that would fish with him, and now his youngest son, Ryan, goes out and fishes with him.
Ryan is probably the fiercest competitor of all my children. He's 12 now.
Okay.
Get the net.
He's been fishing pretty hard with me for the last 4 years.
Small
It gives him a great opportunity to learn sportsmanship and how to do things right and how to go by the rules.
During the Derby, competition is fierce. Even more so for Lee and Ryan.
Yeah, we always kind of place little bets.
Okay, Ryan, this is war, okay? You take that side, I'll take this side.
All I have to do is catch a fish before him.
Seeing that he doesn't make as much money as I make, we call it $2 to $10 bet. He puts in $2 if he loses, and I put in $10 if I lose, so.
So I think I'm gonna get a better deal. I'm gonna get the net.
Yeah, you get the net, but that's, I'll probably end up taking him at the back there. Off the stern, Ryan, because he's,
Gee, he's so casual.
yeah, well, there it is. Hello, lost him at the boat. You didn't want to come in.
See?
Lee almost won the bet. Almost. But this is horseshoes.
Well, he bit through the leader, so I guess it's my fault. The fish in the boat, they're the ones that count. So I can't really make the excuses. He won today.
At the end of the day, everyone competing in the Derby brings in their best fish to be weighed.
Holy smokes!
So Eddie, tell me how you got this big fish.
You can see these people and talk and tell our fish stories about last year or what's going to come this year. So
They formed a line with their catch, big or small, and they shuttled through the door and up to the scales and told by which method they caught it.
After every weigh-in, each division has a winner. This wasn't Ryan's day, but there would be others. And when the competition ended a month later, Ryan had caught the biggest fish in his division. They're still pulling plenty of fish out of these waters, but as Jay Gustafaro warned, this may not last forever. Water quality affects everyone who lives and works along it. Not far from Martha's Vineyard is a beautiful historic city with some of the most polluted water in the country, Boston, Massachusetts. That's where the Driftwood crew met Paul Levy. Paul calls himself a high-priced plumber, and not because he's handy with a wrench around the house. It's because he's head of the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority.
Thank you, Commissioner. I want to commend the DPH for conducting this study. I think it's a very important one and will be very
Levy is primarily responsible for cleaning up Boston Harbor.
I mean, if you want to talk about having a burden on your shoulders, this has got to be it.
There's a great tradition in the Boston metropolitan area of dumping things in the harbor. In a sense, it began with the Boston Tea Party a long time ago. So we realize now that we've reached the limits of what the harbor can absorb. Certainly it can absorb a certain amount, but not what 2.5 million people and industries put out in there.
Many things pollute Boston's harbor, including tons of residue from planes using Logan Airport.
As you see planes taking off and landing, you see heavy black exhaust coming out of the back of them, landing on the water.
We were kind of hoping we'd see direct evidence of the pollutants in the harbor. Most of it isn't noticeable.
The sewer system is invisible. People don't know it's not working right when it's not working right because they can still flush the toilets. Now, what they don't realize is that that very act is causing pollution in the harbor because the treatment plants aren't working properly.
Fish from these waters have the highest incidence of liver tumors and fin rot on the East Coast. So what's being done about it? Well, a $3 billion cleanup campaign expected to take the rest of this century.
The job is going to get done one way or the other. For two reasons. One, it's the right thing to do and needs to get done. The other is there's a court order ordering it to be done. It's an old Indian expression that says, we don't inherit the earth from ancestors, we borrow it from our children. So it makes you think long-term, makes people remember that we're stewards here. We don't own this. And we're just kind of borrowing it, and it would be nice to leave it in better shape than when we found it.
There's not much to add to that, but it's a good thought to end this part of our journey. Driftwood had come almost 1,400 miles from the cradle of civilization in the New World to the birthplace of the American Revolution.
We came across some of the places that were first settled in North America. You go to the harbors. You go to the potato fields. You go all the different places we've been, and you see the way it's been done for hundreds of years is still being done. The tradition is continuing.
In the weeks ahead, join the crew of the Driftwood as they travel more than 25,000 miles and rediscover the stories along the waterways that link the people of North America with one another and the rest of the world. Come along as they explore man's relationship with the water he treasures and despoils, plays with and fights with, and cannot live without. Join these young people on the next leg of On the Waterways.
Funding for this program was provided by the Bamana Corporation of Fort Wayne, Indiana.